Welcome back to my channel, Star Booze.
All right, that's how it is. It's that finger, and the break is in 2.5 weeks. Look, how does it appear? What does it look like? Imagine this. London is experiencing a calm April morning. Additionally, the rock industry is about to undergo a fundamental upheaval. Jimmy Page, Led Zeppelin's elusive, mysterious guitar master, finally expresses his opinions after decades of quiet, cryptic interviews and well-chosen phrases. It was about the musicians he detested, the betrayals, the ego conflicts, the backstabbing, and the individuals he couldn't stand. Not about music or legacy. Furthermore, the reality is more sinister than anyone had anticipated. Jimmy Page was the calm center of a raging storm for years. He was the brain behind the scenes, the magician, who created riffs that would forever change the landscape of rock and roll. However, even while the rest of the band broke down in front of the world, Page remained reticent and enigmatic, while his instrument talked in tongues. However, tension developed behind closed doors. Page was more than just the creative force behind heaven's stairs. He was a man struggling with addiction, demons, and a deep-seated dislike of some music stars. Names that would astonish you, and ones he had never dared to say out loud till now. Eric Clapton was the British blues golden boy in the early 1960s. Page first admired him, but her admiration soon gave way to subdued animosity. Page replaced Clapton after he left the Yardbirds, only to be subjected to incessant comparisons and silent criticism. Page's idea of vast experimental soundscapes ran counter to Clapton's image as a purist. In a scenario that continuously set them against each other, they became into opposites. Clapton brushed off Page's work as being exaggerated. If there ever was a worst of, it's not this one. You know, it's a point of reference, if you will. Page, on the other hand, thought Clapton was narrow-minded and patronizing. The musical battlefield of the time was shaped by their rivalry. Page, however, saw it as more than just music. It turned personal, and any respect that remained gradually turned to silence that would persist for decades. Previously, Jeff Beck was a friend. They exchanged secrets, dreams, and studios. Together, they formed a generation's sound by exchanging riffs like secrets. However, success turned their relationship into something harsher and colder. Beck never really forgiven Page for following him into the Yardbirds. Page could feel the resentment in every sidelong gaze, even though he never spoke it out loud. With time, the air between them grew thicker. Interviews became platforms for nuanced insults, forcing friends to take sides. No major blow-up or public outcry occurred, but it wasn't necessary. Every guitar solo they performed was haunted by the specter of their feud. Page's face grew a little more stern each time Beck's name was mentioned. Their interactions backstage were awkward and short. Eye contact moments were intense, akin to verbal sparring. Both painters were aware that their reflections were too near them. Two titans from the same time period, both with their own ideas on what the guitar could be. However, only one legend could take center stage. Both of them were aware of it. Then, there came Townshend, Pete. Always bold, always outspoken, and always prepared with a slap-smacking joke. Townshend ridiculed the ambition and showmanship of Led Zeppelin, dismissing them as derivative. He viewed them as opportunists crafting the code stories of insurrection rather than as pioneers. He never understood, however, that Zeppelin was doing more than simply rebelling. They were using mythology, summoning storms, and harnessing innate energy. No one realized how much Townshend's derision hurt. Although Page never retaliated in public, he harbored his resentment like a loaded gun, waiting and festering. The atmosphere in the room changed when Townshend and Page finally met in person, which wasn't often. Townshend joked around. Page gave a faint smile. There was no need to speak. Like fog, the contempt lingered. Another subdued adversary was Blackmore, the melancholy powerhouse of Deep Purple. The foundation of their relationship was tension, unspoken but constant. Imitation accusations quickly started to circulate as the two guitarists danced on parallel tracks, each pushing the limits of hard music in their own unique way. They were continually compared by fans and media, and the pressure caused admiration to turn to mistrust. More often than not, their guitar duels took place behind the scenes. In an unseen arms race of technological superiority, the two rarely shared bills, but they did share headlines and their reputations were entwined. The atmosphere between them became electrifying when they finally met on tour circuits. Conversations were avoided by cold nods. There weren't many words, and even fewer kind words. It felt to Page like looking into a darker side of himself. Someone who had made different decisions but was nevertheless burdened by the same things. These tensions weren't temporary. They were emotional dead ends that persisted for many years. Missed chances and damaged egos cast a shadow on the silent wars of pride. Every note had a price in the society Page lived in, and every friendship ran the risk of turning into a rivalry. John Lennon was among the most unusual names Page found difficult to pronounce. Even though Lennon wasn't a guitarist competition, in the conventional sense, Page didn't like his contempt for heavy rock. Lennon regularly attacked the hard rock culture as crude and undeveloped during the latter years of the Beatles and into his solo career. Page, who firmly thought that Zeppelin's booming sound was an artistic achievement, thought that Lennon's comments were haughty and exclusive. Although they didn't meet paths much, the mood became chilly when they did, whether it was at award, events, galas, or smoky after-parties. While Page stood silently, rage seething behind his eyes, Lennon would make casual remarks about Zeppelin's alleged lack of nuance. Page was shocked to be rejected by a Beatle in front of his peers and the media. In private, he started calling Lennon a snob who lived in a bubble of self-importance rather than a visionary. Page was suspicious of Lennon because of the discrepancy between his assertive, frequently scathing demeanor in private and his peaceful public persona. Page never forgot the moment he saw a man wearing a mask, even if the rest of the world viewed Lennon as a sage. The more deeply one explores Page's grievance archive, the more ghosts that show up, some recognizable, others unexpected. Every one of them shares a tale of conflict, rejection, or acrimonious rivalry. They were more than names to Page. He was followed by these shadows from one decade to the next. Keith Richards, known for his caustic tongue and slouched attitude, never acknowledged Zeppelin. They were an obvious target for him since they were conceited and theatrical. From the outside, it appeared to be jovial rock and roll banter, but Page's eyes were filled with barely veiled disdain. Richards threw clever jabs at Page's onstage persona, ridiculed Zeppelin's epics, and sneered at their mysticism. For Page, it went beyond simple jest. It was sabotage, a means of sowing doubt and discord among both critics and admirers, and it was successful. During the years when Page was slipping into his own legend and losing himself to addiction, every insult was more painful. David Gilmour was more subdued, reserved, and almost tactful, but his stillness said more than words could. Gilmour revealed little when Zeppelin's success was brought up with Pink Floyd's, but Page sensed something colder behind that control: disapproval. Despite being titans of the same age, they never worked together. Gilmour never offered assistance or acknowledged Zeppelin's outrageous theatricality. In his own way, Page interpreted that as a slight, not loud or spectacular, but subtly cruel, like being disregarded by someone who can see right through you. Backstage, they simply had a quick mechanical interaction, a glance, a nod, and nothing but distance, and that distance was irreversible. Later, Page thought about how it seemed like two universes circling the same sun but denying each other light. Then came the punks, a movement that sought to destroy the old guard rather than merely critique it. Jimmy Page was a representation of all things bloated and self-indulgent in rock to the sneering adolescents of the late 1970s. They perceived His flowing capes, mysterious symbols, and 10-minute guitar solos as conceit rather than as works of art. The Clash's Sex Pistols and other bands didn't simply ignore Zeppelin. In each interview, lyric and sneer, they destroyed them. Page was shocked to see kids who had barely picked up guitars making fun of his band. He had been creating sonic cathedrals for decades, only to have them classified as monuments to excess. Not only was he being turned away, they were erasing him. The old masters were left behind while magazines focused on three-chord rage and spiked hair. Page felt like a monarch whose kingdom had collapsed in an instant, forgotten and abandoned. The suffering was intense and intimate. Fame wasn't the only factor. It had to do with purpose. I learned identity via legacy. The hush that followed was deafening to a man who had previously controlled arenas like a magician summoning thunder. These went beyond simple rivalries. They were full-fledged conflicts between cultures, identity, and vision. Page wasn't merely avoiding rivals. He watched as all he had stood for was abandoned by the world, and it was a reckoning that a guy who based his kingdom on sound and shadows would never forget.